Hello everyone and welcome back to the Second Party Podcast. On a previous episode we were talking a little bit about different things that can affect the likelihood of success or failure in a marriage. One of the things that could negatively impact it is getting married at a particularly young age, which is actually something that we did. We got married when we were both 20. But there was something that we did on the positive side of things to kind of counteract that. And that's that we did a good amount of premarital counseling beforehand, right?
Just kind of canceled that out. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Just
that's
even
the
one
attempt.
for one.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that we did in premarital counseling, obviously they talk about a bunch of different things, and whomever you're doing it with will kind of structure it differently depending on the couple and what some of those pain points are. But one of the things that they do in premarital counseling in general is they'll have kind of a forum to talk about what each person is expecting and what you've experienced in your past, right? So what did you see growing up? What was your living situation like? What was your parents' relationship like? Because oftentimes that informs what you are expecting and wanting out of your relationship going forward.
Yeah, well, there was a whole section about subconscious expectations or whatever they called it, something like that.
Yeah.
And it was basically a table you had to go through, and it listed all these different things like taking out the trash, paying the bills,
Yeah.
like making dinners, doing the laundry, all these tasks around the house kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you had to fill in like which of your parents did that thing.
Yeah.
And then you had to say which of yourself and your fiance did you expect to do that in your marriage, and then you would compare and talk about those things. And the point is like, yeah, maybe those tasks are kind of trivial, like who's gonna take out the trash, right? I don't think that's gonna cause a serious issue in a marriage. Maybe it will, I don't know.
Well, the devil's in the details of a lot of things. Little things
right,
add up.
But
yeah,
that's what I'm saying. It's like the point is not about figuring out who's going to take out the trash. The point is about learning how to communicate the expectations you have and understand that you do have expectations, because people go into a marriage and they don't realize that actually in the back of their mind, that's why they called it subconscious expectations. You do have things there that you're expecting to happen in a certain way, but you don't consciously realize that because the way you've grown up just seems so normal to you. So to one person it may be, well, obviously, the wife is cooking dinner. Like, I never even thought that was a thing I'd ever have to think about doing.
Yeah, or obviously the husband's gonna mow the lawn.
Right, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Right. Because it just seems normal to you. So that's why it was specifically comparing against what your parents did and trying to recognize that, like, you have preconceived notions based on how you were growing up, most likely, that you are going to carry into this. So it was, like, teaching you how to talk about that and recognize that that is a thing.
Yeah. Basically, everyone's going to have some important differences in how they were raised, right? Like, even you and I, we grew up very close to each other, very similar types of culture, I would say.
Yeah, kind of.
But
I mean,
our families actually were structured very differently between us.
I mean, it was similar in that, we both had a mom and a dad who were married and in the home, which is a bit of a luxury in this day and age, especially in our generation. So it was similar in that sense, but our parents are very different.
Yeah, like, for instance, my parents had kind of like the typical gender role kind of thing going. Like, think 1950s. Right, my dad was like the sole breadwinner. He went to work. He was, like the tall, strong dude. Very successful. And my mom she was like the quintessential. I think you say she's like the classic quintessential 1950s housewife, right?
Oh yeah, she stay home with the kids, cooking,
cooks, cleans,
home cooked dinners every day. She was amazing at cooking.
She does sewing. She loves art. She likes gardening.
Yeah, it's like her free time. She'll paint a canvas or plant some rosebuds in the garden. Like, I don't even know. I don't know what your mom did with her free time.
It's very, like you said, classic 1950s.
Which is ironic because your parents are also both, the way you grew up and the culture you grew up was not super like conservative Christian like you'd expect with that kind of dynamic, which is
Yeah,
very
kind of.
interesting.
You're right.
And mine was.
Yeah, and then you kind of have the flip side of
So
things
mine was very like, conservative Christian, go to church.
culturally.
Yeah, culturally. Grew up in church. Church was like, non-negotiable kind of thing. But the dynamic between my parents was so much different. Like both my parents worked full time for, most of the time I was growing up. There was a period of time where my mom like only worked 3 or 4 days a week, so she kind of worked part-time for a little bit, and my mom like started her own business, so she was doing that. Very not like your mom, I should say.
Non-traditional.
She was very independent. She's very like strong-willed and strong-minded. And
Yeah.
my dad is a very like, I always describe him as kind of a mellow person. Like,
He's
he doesn't
very
he doesn't really
agreeable.
voice his opinions. He's very
Yeah.
agreeable. And he's just kind of like a mellow, like quirky, kind of nerdy dad guy.
Yeah.
And my mom was very like strong-willed and like opinionated and vocal about that kind of about her opinions.
Yeah, my
And
family was like even in that aspect, like the exact opposite. Like my dad is like the classic
like
head of the
your dad
household.
makes the decisions in the household
Yeah, pretty much.
for the most part.
Yeah.
Like
That
in
doesn't
in
mean
my
that my mom
house,
doesn't
like
have a
my
say, but
mom made
yeah.
the decisions
Yeah,
in
and
the
your mom
household.
makes the
It was
decisions.
always like
Yeah.
when we were kids, it was like, oh, do you want to go to a friend's house, whatever. We always go ask mom, like we always did. Or sometimes we would go ask dad because like he would say, well, sure, whatever, I don't care. And then mom would come home and be like, no, you can't do that thing. So it
Sure,
was a
yeah.
very different kind of dynamic that we grew up with. But it was interesting because mine was more like quote unquote religious and yours wasn't.
Yeah, it's the way they describe it, everything changed like I don't know, 6 months to a year after having me. I think my mom's just maternal instincts and my dad's paternal instincts just kicked in so hard at that point.
Probably, yeah.
And
And
they just fell into those highly, highly traditional roles, which is wonderful that it worked out that way for them.
and I guess when I say they weren't as religious, like they did bring you guys to church, right? Like you
Yeah,
were
yeah.
a church going family. But correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you would have described your family as like a very religiously oriented family.
Yeah, it's kind of a bit of an interesting one and one that we've talked about a little bit before, but from an outside view, kind of looking back, my parents themselves were not really religious, but from a kid view, there were a bunch of things in the household that revolved around that. Like, we were not Christmas, Easter families. We were at church every single week. We went to the youth group thing every single week. We prayed before bed every single night. We prayed before dinner every single night. It was like they wanted that for us,
And not so much for themselves,
but
kind of
didn't
thing.
have it themselves. And to your point, I think that maybe that just stems out of the like maternal, paternal instinct, traditional role kind of thing. Looking at all of these things, at these differences between our two families, really conscientiously deciding what it is that we want to take into our relationship, I felt like it was really beneficial doing premarital counseling to uh, bring that to the forefront of one's mind and to kind of hash out some of those details, right? The stuff that seems kind of trivial, but it really does matter.
Yeah.
And I think that, obviously there are positives and negatives to every single relationship. And I think what we try and do, whether it be on like a really small level or on a big level, we try and look at both of our families and ask ourselves not just which way is better here, but what is the best way, right? Maybe it's the way that my family does it. Maybe it's the way that your family does it. Maybe it's a hybrid or a totally different way. But I do think that we really sit down and analyze how best to do that.
Yeah, for us, right?
Yeah.
Like it is gonna depend a little bit based on who's in the relationship, because different people have different aspirations and skills and everything.
Yeah. One of the big differences between our parents and what we do is I think you and I do a lot of hard things together, right? My parents and your parents, I think they kind of, it, I think they
Operate
do,
kind of individually.
yeah, they operate individually. It's a great way of putting it. And my parents, it's because they're more in this like traditional style role, right? They're totally different. They're totally different types of things that they do and lives that they lead, even though, right, they're like living in the same house with the same family. And I think the same kind of thing is true for your parents, right? Your mom had this more flexible work schedule for most of your life, is a very different style of job, and your dad's very laid back, and I think it always had a little bit more structure, right?
Yeah, he worked like a typical office job.
Yeah. And I think I see a lot of really beneficial things to doing those hard things together. And actually, you can see some of this in like psychology and the media. So if you've ever watched a show like The Bachelor, right, what do they always have these people doing?
Oh, they're like go jump off a cliff
Yeah.
together. Yeah.
It's crazy stuff.
It simulates an emotional connection.
Yeah. It's
It
creating
facilitates, maybe that's a better
yeah,
word.
facilitates that emotional connection. They're putting people in stressful scenarios to increase pair bonding, right? And that happens because when you're stressed out and you go through that stressful situation with somebody else, and then you both make it out together.
You look at each other a little differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's not just because, like, oh, well, now we have this similar thing. But it's also that there's like this emotional connection between the two of you, and your body has learned from that emotional situation that this person is, right, like going to help you get through that and has the ability to get through that with you.
Assuming you've been able to navigate through it healthily and productively,
Even relatively,
rather
yeah.
than turning against each other and
Sure.
fostering bitterness for each other, which I think does happen to some people. I've heard people make comments like, oh, I can never work with my wife, I can never work with my husband. Like, just the thought of them having to get along for a full 8 hours together is like, I need to be at work away from my spouse or whatever. And I think you and I are in a somewhat unique kind of position where we are pretty similar in certain ways, like in interests, and we're both engineers, so we're both pretty like technically minded people, and we're interested in the same types of like school subjects. And we had like a lot of practice working together because we were in an engineering program together.
It's more than just that, right? Like, we worked our way through our whole undergraduate degrees together in the same classes. We did senior design together,
Right, which was a really
which was
stressful
grueling.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We
and
ran a small business together during that same time. We work on projects together at home all the time. We renovated our whole house together. We run the podcast together.
I know what I'm saying is I think we might be mildly more predisposed to success in that arena because we already have similar interests and similar personalities in certain types of ways. Like, both of us are interested in organization. We're both very type A, neat kind of people.
Sure.
So we do
Yeah.
projects because it's like, oh, we want to add these closet organizers and we don't want to spend money because we're both frugal people. So we're going to figure it out and do it ourselves. So we're in somewhat of a unique position where we are similar enough to where it kind of comes naturally, having similar interests, that we just end up doing things together.
Yeah, I mean, interest is definitely part of it, but I also think that a lot of that can be learned. I think like if you wanted to get closer to your spouse, if you wanted to be better working, if you wanted to have a more functional relationship with your spouse, the answer is you do hard things together. You practice,
Yeah.
right? Like I quote this to you all the time. There's a movie Oblivion, and there's a couple in it, and they report to this like upper level management, and what upper level management asks them all the time is, "Are you still an effective team?" To both of the people. So I joke around like, "Are you still an effective team?" Whenever we're doing stuff, because you touched on this earlier when you were talking about people who say that they couldn't work like professionally with their significant other. Like I that honestly blows me away. Like I don't know how you could sit here and be like, yeah, I can run a productive household and raise kids, but there's no way that I would work with, my spouse or have to communicate with them on a work project. It's like I I don't know about you, but I
Yeah.
think raising a kid and running a household and communicating like that is way more difficult
Navigating
than
difficult things in life. Yeah.
yeah, is way more difficult than some work project. And by the way, people are saying in principle they couldn't, not that their spouse doesn't work in the same field or something. They're saying I could not work professionally with my spouse. Period.
Yeah.
That blows me away. I would actually want to work with you more.
That's very kind.
Well, I mean, you're smart, you're a good team member, and we're predisposed to working with each other already.
Well, it's like the most important skills to cultivate in a marriage should translate well to like being able to work with work colleagues.
Hmm.
If you can communicate well, if you can lay out expectations well, if you can compromise with other people, if you can put aside your own interests while still being able to advocate for yourself well,
Hmm.
those are all skills that would translate into a workplace pretty well.
Yeah. Well, I think so. There are kind of two parts to this, I think. One is you've got doing the hard thing, right? And then I think on the other side, you've got like respect. Okay. So you start out, you do a hard thing together, you get through it together, right?
And what do you mean when you say hard thing, by the way? Just like try difficult projects, go through
Yeah, some
trials.
kind of trial, some kind of tribulation, something that tests you and requires you to work with your spouse or work
Okay.
with this
So like
this
try
other
to
person.
your car broke down, try to fix it together. Or
It can be as small as that,
train for a
or
triathlon together.
yeah, or it could
Or
be a much bigger thing. You could go through some traumatic event. Now, I'm not suggesting going through some like
well yeah,
serious traumatic event.
don't initiate a traumatic event purposefully. But
Yeah,
you
but
you can
that will bring
stimulate.
people together,
Yeah, I think
oftentimes.
what you're talking about is you can stimulate difficult like micro difficulties in a sense with
Sure.
hey, we would love to have like a bookshelf in this corner. What if we try to make one together and we have no idea how to do it, so we're gonna have to try and figure it out together. And again, maybe you and I are
Yeah.
predisposed to that kind of thinking because we are engineers, so we kind of like problems and trying to figure them out. But I do think it's a good skill to practice. Like pick something within an arena and a caliber that's reasonable for you to be able to accomplish.
Yeah, but I think you can start even smaller than that. Like, let's say you're going to go grocery shopping, right? There's a goal in mind.
Yeah.
You are going to encounter stupid things, right? Like, they're not going to have the granola that you always get at the store. And you're going to have to go somewhere else. Or you're going to have to figure out a different way of doing this. Or somebody's going to cut in front of you in traffic. Or you want to park somewhere and your spouse wants to park somewhere else, right? Like, you'll encounter these micro trials as well. Just attempting to do like even trivial tasks like going and
Yeah.
getting groceries for the household.
I think that's why we hone in on like projects around the house so much, because I don't think there's ever been a house project that anyone's ever done that has gone smoothly and perfectly the entire time. So
Yeah.
if you embark on a home project as simple as trying to hang a picture, something's going to go wrong.
Inevitably, yeah.
It's like
basically,
a law of nature.
yeah. Yeah. Like, inevitably, you're going to encounter some trial. And I think the more things that you can go through like that, and the more that you can kind of ramp it up and take on harder things and get through them together, the stronger that makes your relationship. So maybe early on, you have to start with just going on one shopping trip, right? And
Do
then
a 5K together.
yeah, and then it's going on a big grocery run, and then it's doing a 5K, and then it's renovating an entire bathroom yourself, and then it's
Whoa,
renovating
a big
a house.
Jump. That was a big jump. I was gonna say maybe like, I don't know, replace the cabinet pulls in your kitchen. But
Yeah, these things happen, you know. but you kind of slowly take steps up, and I think that there's kind of like an exponential progression there, because you've got like a feedback loop here. So on one side you've got doing the hard thing, right? And then on the other side, so you start out, you do the hard thing, you get through it together. And then what happens is you grow closer to your significant other, and I think at least you begin to respect that other person more.
yeah, because you've seen the hard thing because you've had to go through it yourself, and you said,
Mm-hmm.
wow, this other person went through that hard thing or succeeded in this way. I couldn't figure out, what tool we needed to get this thing done, but this person figured it out. I
Yeah.
respect you for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people balk at this, but like respect is earned. Okay? That's
Yeah.
the reality. You don't
Not general human
not decency, not
or
yeah,
dignity. Like everyone deserves general human
dignity. There you go.
dignity.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But I'm talking about actual respect, where there's some level of, like, maybe you call it reverence, right? Where you see this person as having a capability, and you respect them as a result of that. And like, too often people, like, I think with our parents at least, the reason that I think there's a differentiation is too often they don't see what each other does that is so hard, right? Like, let's use my parents for example. My dad goes off to work and he just freaking kills it, right? And he makes a bunch of money and he brings it home to the family. My mom doesn't understand what going out and like having to make money and provide for a family is like, and she doesn't really even know, relatively speaking, how successful or unsuccessful my father is at it.
She
Right?
has no conception of the corporate world.
Correct. So it's difficult to appreciate that if you don't understand it. And then on the flip side, right? My mom's at home and she's slaving away over dinner every night. And it's like, my dad hasn't cooked in how long? Right? How is he going to conceptualize the amount of time and effort that went into this? Because she had to plan it out, she had to go to the grocery store, she had to get all the things, she had to prep it all, she had to bring it all together, and all that needed to be timed so that everyone sits down at the table and eats it. And the three different components of the meal are all ready at the same time and hot.
And she's got to clean the house, and
Yeah.
she's got to, manage all the kids' lunches, and
Yeah. And like, these are both complicated things that the other person, maybe they can like try and intellectually understand and appreciate it as much as possible, but you're not going to understand it as intimately as if you also did that thing, or if you did that thing with that person and saw all of the struggles and saw all of the nuances. Like you were talking about earlier with a project, something inevitably goes wrong. Well, there are plenty of people who don't do projects or don't do projects of a certain type and just think, oh, well, everything's roses and lilies. It's a walk in the park. It's so easy.
yeah, you just replace a valve and
Yeah,
the
of
water's
course.
fixed.
You just unscrew the thing, you screw the other thing in, bada bing, bada boom. That's it. No, it's way
Right.
you
And
encounter other things.
I don't think you're not in any way saying like, oh, both parties need to be doing the same kinds of jobs and it needs to be a totally like equal in the sense that you're doing the exact same things. No, but I think you do need to do some things together. If you're not
Correct. Yeah.
daily doing the same kind of things where you can experientially understand what the other person does for the household,
Yeah.
like that's okay. You don't need to be doing the exact same thing, but you should be doing some things together so
Yeah.
that you're cultivating that teamwork spirit.
Yeah. Like we do things all the time. I think you were tweeting about this when we were changing the fixtures in our shower,
Yeah.
right?
It was a disaster. I
It
tweeted the whole
was
thing.
just very annoying, right? But there was a point where you didn't know what to do, and there was a point where I didn't know what to do, right? And you provided value, and I provided value.
There was a point where we thought we were going to have to call a plumber and they were going to have to open up our
Yeah.
wall and we were going to have to pay thousands of dollars for a project we thought was going to be $150 in a
Yeah.
Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
But
But like at the end of it, I sit here and I look at you and I go, this project would not be successful, would not be where it is right now without you. And then at least I think you look at me and you go
yeah.
the same thing. Right? Like I couldn't have done that
It's
thing
'cause
and I
we
go I couldn't have done that thing.
we worked together on it.
Yeah.
It was quite literally a joint effort.
Yeah. And at the end of that, when you realize that you need that other person and they bring immense value, that is where, at least I think, a lot of that like real respect is found. Right? And then you go back into that feedback loop. The more that I respect you and the tighter knit that we are, the more willing we are to take on harder and harder things. Right? So you kind of got like a feedback loop here, I think at least. And I think
Yeah.
it ends up kind of exponential. And I think that oftentimes starts with kind of like maybe what you'd even call like calibration, right? Like when you're running those errands together, that's just like calibrating between the two of you. It's getting on the same wavelength. It's making sure that you can effectively communicate basic things.
Which, by the way, even that in and of itself is not necessarily an easy task.
Oh, no.
That's why, you start at the premarital and one of the first things you talk about is communicating expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can say that all you want and you can conceptually understand it, but it's actually not an easy thing to do. To learn how to actually communicate what's on your mind, because in order to do that, you first need to understand what's on your mind, understand your expectations, understand what you think or desire or want out of a certain thing. Then you need to like figure out how to translate that from a thought in your mind to something that's going to be understandable to the other person. And communicating something like that is not necessarily an easy task.
Yeah. And I think, part of what you're doing in some of that premarital counseling is opening up those communication channels and like that's the very beginning of understanding how that other person's communicating.
Right.
And I think it helps like kind of put parameters around things. But then I do think that you really have to do some of those like I think you need to stay up to date. I think you need to stay calibrated with your spouse by doing some of those seemingly trivial things together.
Yeah. And I think when you respect each other, it becomes easier to communicate because you're more willing to be open and you're more willing to listen.
Yeah, and I think through that communication, you begin to better understand your role and the other person's role, right? And appreciate those differences, right? So, like when we were doing that shower project, you were the one who was able to take a step back and do a bunch of research online to try and find out, like, okay, how should we try and work through this thing, right? And I was pretty busy at the time, okay? But then it came down to a point where we were going to try and saw off, it's called a nut.
It's a bonnet nut, is what it was called.
Okay, yeah. We got to a point where we had to like saw off a bonnet nut.
Yeah.
And you were struggling with that, and I was like, okay, I can step in and I can do this.
And that's when I was at the point of bursting into tears almost, because
Yeah.
I thought we had like broken the shower valve and we needed a plumber, and there was like
Yeah.
no way out of it.
But we figured it out together, and then we both understand more of what our roles are. You know, each person has kind of like a unique role in a relationship, and I think for us, and we've talked about this a bit before, but I think something that I came to understand more recently is how your influence is different than my influence.
What do you mean by that?
So I guess maybe I'll talk about how I think you influence me, and then maybe you can talk about the flip side. So I think.
Oh, you mean our influence on each other?
Yeah.
Oh.
So I think you influence me kind of like how Ann Darrow or Dawn influences King Kong. Like, you influence me in ways that other people can't. Like, I'll sit down and I'll be having a debate with my family, and they make like a few good points, but they fail to convince me or make like a really compelling argument. And I'm really disagreeable and like difficult to convince of things, and they fail to do so. But then you know me so well, and you could come in and convince me of things that like others couldn't. Now that's not to say that like I can just be convinced of anything by you, but if there's somebody who's going to convince me of something, you're going to be the person to do it because you understand my motivations and my communication style. And I think this is really the role that's described in like Genesis 2:18 when God gives Adam Eve, and she's described as like a helper, but I think a better translation is kind of like an adversary or like a constructive critic.
Yeah.
Right? Like she's the one to come in and say to Adam, like, you're wrong in this way, but the good side of this is that you can do things better and you can improve in this way. And I think, you know, it's kind of reminiscent of the saying that says, like, men rule the world and women rule the men.
Yeah. I tweeted about this a little bit not too long ago.
Okay, yeah.
Like a short thread.
Probably when we were talking about it.
Essentially saying that where, you know, having gender roles in a relationship is not oppressive to either party if they're instituted properly and if each party recognizes the value and the importance of the other.
Yeah.
So you're only going to feel oppressed in your gender role. Like, I kind of feel weird using that term, but I think you know what I mean here. You're only going to feel oppressed in like your specific role that you play in the relationship, when usually these roles fall into typical categories based on genders. You're only going to feel oppressed if you don't recognize the value in that role or your partner doesn't recognize the value in that role.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that both roles are valuable. And kind of what I was saying was, yeah, like, you are a very decisive, conscientious, and very opinionated person.
Yeah.
I am not. I am indecisive. I am maybe somewhat conscientious, somewhat opinionated, but I'm much more easily influenced and much less resolute about things. So you hold very tightly to convictions, and it takes a very strong argument to sway you of anything because you've thought through everything already. You have all these ideas in your mind. So what that does is it makes you a very good, like, natural household leader, because where I might be easily swayed by my temporary emotions or desires or influence from other people, you can be like a strong, decisive anchor, holding to, you know, goals we've already defined, like principles we've already aligned on, and not swaying from those. And I recognize that. And because I can recognize that, I trust you, and I respect, and because I respect you, it's it's not oppressive to me to like kind of follow your lead on things. It's actually a
Sure.
comfort
Okay.
because I respect that. But then, yeah, the interesting flip side of that is that I also have this unique power over you that no, that's a weird way to say it, but weird power over you that no one else really has. Because I know your weaknesses and I
Yeah.
understand you better than other people. And because you also respect me, my thoughts and opinions on things carry a weight with you that no one else's really do.
Yeah.
So this isn't a situation of, me just being like a useless doormat,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like a mutual respect. Like you joke, I'm the only one who could like take you down. So
Yeah.
if you're King
Yeah, I do.
Kong, right, but I'm the one who can take you down, like that's a pretty powerful position still. It's certainly not oppressive, and actually that requires a sense of
Mm-hmm.
mutual submission because I have this weird power over you even though you might be more visibly the natural leader. And this shows up in stories all over the place. Like it's a very typical male female dynamic, and it's very natural in the sense that this is generally, not always, but generally how things work best. It's why things have fallen into that place most naturally over the course of human history. And there's this recurring theme in stories about like women being able to have this sense of controlling the beast kind of nature over men. Like women have this taming effect on men.
I mean, that's like the female hero myth, right? That's Beauty and the
That's
Beast.
Beauty and the
I mean,
Beast, yeah.
look, that's even 50 Shades of Grey.
I know nothing about 50 Shades of Grey, but I'll take your word for that.
Okay, I've not watched it nor have I read it.
Okay.
The general thing is, it's Beauty
It's
and the
yeah,
Beast, but instead of a magical curse, it's uh, mental issues that
okay.
manifest in like
Sexual perversion.
sexual, yeah,
Okay.
perversion. There you go.
Yeah, I mean it's the girls who like the like kind of the bad boys with the hard edge, but they're softened by like a womanly
Yeah,
touch, right? It's Elizabeth Bennet who like softens the proud Mr. Darcy, right?
yeah, yeah,
This is the dynamic that you see throughout history and all over in stories. It's kind of like a cliche, but there's a reason it's cliche.
yeah,
And it's it's not oppressive for either role when these are instituted properly, and they look slightly different for everyone, and not everyone falls into those easily defined categories, and every relationship is different.
hmm
But there is a reason that in principle for most people you tend to see it falling that way.
yeah. And I mean, the you mentioned Pride and Prejudice. Like in that, Mr. Darcy has a flaw, and Elizabeth Bennet has a flaw.
And they both kind of have antidotes to each other.
Yeah, and they highlight the flaws in the other person, but then in the end are made better by their unity and by each of each other being able to like highlight, point out that other person's flaw. Like the Bible kind of talks about that with iron sharpens iron. But I think there's a relationship in the Bible, like a marital relationship, that I think demonstrates and represents this really well. And that's with Isaac and Rebecca. So Isaac's looking for a spouse, and so his dad sends out a servant to a town to try and find someone.
And where is this? Genesis what? Is it
Genesis
30?
24.
24. Okay.
Yeah.
And this is right after Isaac's mother,
Yeah, after she passes away.
Elizabeth.
Yeah.
No, Sarah.
Sarah.
What am I saying? His mother, Sarah,
Yeah,
has passed away.
So his mom's passed away, and they're sending out the servant to try and find Isaac a spouse, right? And the servant stops and is offered a drink of water at this well with all of his camels by a woman, and that woman turns out to be Rebecca. So Rebecca like slaves and gets all this water up for all the camels and for um, the servant and such, and then the servant feels compelled and brings her back, and they get married. And through all of this, actually, Rebecca and Rebecca's family is like in full agreement of this, right? So it's not as if she's
taken against her will or
yeah,
anything.
it's not like she's a non-free agent, right? She can make all of these decisions, okay? And she goes on her own volition, right? And she
She
kind
marries
of
Isaac.
yeah.
Yeah.
And she goes and marries Isaac. And I think it's so interesting. There are a few other times where this is a case, but you have this woman at the well, right? And she's in a desert, right? Because we're talking about kind of the Middle East, Israel area, okay? And we've got this dry, deserted desert and a well. And there's this woman hauling water up from that well. I think that's so beautiful and symbolic because there's this woman pulling water, like an oftentimes cleansing and life giving symbol of chaos, out of the desert. Then she's the one who's chosen to go to Isaac, who has just lost his mother and is in this desert area. And she's the one that like kind of breathes new life into his life and rejuvenates it. And she does this with like a very feminine sense of chaos. And I just think it's so interesting. And that's kind of how I think like, you know, a really great biblically based marriage is, right? You've got both people helping each other out with the things that they struggle with, and they're both engaging in this like willingly. So that's how I kind of think that you have like an effect on me and how you influence me. So how is it that you think that I influence you then?
Well, I guess I talked about it a little bit in when I was talking about the thread I wrote, but I think I can be very indecisive. I think I can be easily swayed by, temporary emotions or desires. And I think you can be like a steady constant. And I think you can also like you do a very good job honing in on specific goals and staying focused to those.
Okay.
And we set up like long-term goals and we have things we work towards like in our personal lives, and I can be easily like whatever. Like once it starts to get hard or I have a different desire, let's go a different way. But you are like very strong and steady staying the course.
Mm-hmm.
um that's probably how I would answer that. Now that we've talked about that, when you first started talking about influence, where I thought you were going was, I used to joke about when we started dating and stuff, I started adopting a lot of like interests or hobbies of yours, and it seemed like that didn't go the other way at all.
Yeah.
um, I didn't, have hobby influence on you maybe, but like we started doing things that you were interested in, or um, I started learning about things that you were interested in, like cars. Like I never knew anything about cars before. Then all of a sudden I would be making comments about cars at the dinner table with my family, and my mom would be like, "Who are you? Where did you learn this from?" Um, so I would joke
Yeah.
around like why do I never have any influence on you in that sense? But I think the answer there was just like you already had such established interests and opinions about things, and I was very impressionable.
Yeah.
Not in like a like bad or weird corrupt way, but I didn't have the same level of conviction or strong opinions or hobbies or desires like you did.
Yeah, I think the other thing I'd say is I think I was a bit more exposed to like a larger variety of things. So for instance, like you kind of just listened to like Christian
Oh
music
yeah,
growing up
crappy.
or classical
Right.
music.
I didn't experiment with a lot of different foods. Like
Yeah.
our second date was like you brought me to a Vietnamese place, and it was the first time I'd ever
Yeah.
had curry, and I was like in love from the first bite. But it was just things like that
Yeah.
where you
Yeah.
introduced me to a lot of things that I didn't know about. not because I was like sheltered, I guess, but just because I didn't explore different things, and I didn't have a wide knowledge of all the different nuances of the world, I guess, if you want to say it that way. And
I
you exposed me to a lot of those. Now, we also started dating when we were pretty young. Like we were in high school. So in my own defense, it's not like I was, 25. I didn't know anything about the world. Like I was 17. Um and definitely naive. I was always very very naive, I would say. I didn't really know a lot about the world.
yeah, I think that is something that is attractive to men. Like this is actually,
Mm-hmm.
I have to be a little bit careful about how I phrase this, but I think this is actually something that men find very attractive, and at least in part. Obviously, there are other biological and fertility related reasons why men find young women attractive, but I think one of the reasons that men find young women attractive, at least like on an intellectual level, is like if you think we're trying to have like all the little cogs mesh together, right? We're trying to have two puzzle pieces fit together seamlessly, like very smoothly going forward.
I understood that reference.
Yeah,
All the little cogs mesh together.
wonderful. You got it this time. Anyway, like we're trying to work as this like cohesive unit going forward, right? And I kind of think about it like, yeah, okay, we've got these two things coming together and they're going to mesh, like puzzle pieces, let's say. Okay. Well, how do I find someone who's going to fit with my puzzle piece? And most people go, well, I just have to find the perfect match. I have to find the perfect person. They're out there for me.
Or
And
you
it's
could
like,
find someone easily moldable.
yeah. And it's like, no, you don't need to do that.
Yeah,
The
so
hot take is
so
you just find someone who's like impressionable, or who hasn't made decisions on some of those things yet.
so I understand what you're saying. I understand how this could easily be misinterpreted by a lot of people.
Okay, so help
Because
me explain it
because
in a less terrible way.
that I don't know that this is necessarily how it has to work for everyone.
No, I'm
I
not
think
saying
I
that.
think this is more like what you're doing right now, describing how it worked for us, not necessarily
Sure.
prescribing this is how it should be.
Well, I'm
It,
also saying like I think this is in part why men find like the stereotype is like the young virgin female attractive.
like there's some subconscious reason in there because they're impressionable. Yeah.
Yeah.
I quite possibly. I mean, obviously the watch out there is like that can be misapplied and obviously turn tyrannical
Of
and bad.
course.
So I think it really depends, but I understand what you're saying, which is that if the two people in the relationship, and this is a if the two people in the relationship fall into the types of personalities that would lend them to fitting within those typical gender roles like what we talked about when I was talking about them, and they're not oppressive for either one if both recognize the value of the other, and if they're not oppressively forced on each other, right? It has to be both people willingly falling into
Mm-hmm.
those roles. But if this is how it works for your relationship and both people willingly kind of fall into those roles and recognize the value of each other, that's probably more like what's going to happen, because the man is going to be the natural leader and they're going to kind of guide the direction that the ship is sailing in
Okay,
a sense.
here's something. So I initially spoke to the male side of things because, well, I'm a male. But now I've been thinking about it a little bit more, and here's an interesting thing. I initially spoke to the male side of things, but let me speak to the female side of things now too. Okay? The benefit to a female getting married to a man who's young. Okay? So I'm making the case in general for getting married young. Okay? So again, the benefit for the male side is finding some more impressionable, think like young female. Okay? Well, it'll be easier for us to meld and mesh together because less things have been decided on yet. Okay. Now let's flip it around. What's the benefit to the female side of getting married young? Okay. And this is something that I think really helps you in your role. Okay. When you look at me, you don't see just who I am today. You see the nerdy 12-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old, the kid who's working a food service job. Like, you see that in me now too.
Yeah.
So if you think about it, like, imagine some titan of industry, right? And they go meet some young woman for the first time. That young woman always sees him as some titan of industry, right? He's always had a bunch of money to
rather than what he had to go through to get to that point.
Yeah. So now, not only do you like appreciate the struggle that I went through, but also you're not impressed by all the flashes and the bling and all these things. You look through all of that and you see me, at least in part, as like that young kid who had the potential that you saw. So there's a part of you that like cuts through all the junk and sees the real me, because we got together at a young age. And I think that's something beautiful too. And that allows you to, like, what's the phrase that's like too often used now? Like, speak truth to power, right? Like, you see through whatever heights I may have achieved because you were there from the beginning. You see me as just like
and
that young dude.
You've kind of like, in a sense, played a role in that because you've been along for the ride
Ride or die, yeah.
Supporting, helping along the way, maybe working on, your own accomplishments that you've both been able to see growth in each other. And I think part of it also goes back to what we were talking about before with just the typical cliches and stories. Like, look at romance novels that get big. Women in general are attracted to men who are strong, providers, determined, hard workers, and like are going to be someone they can follow joyously and willingly. Right? It's the Bella is attracted to Edward because of this interesting, mysterious, raw nature of him and the type of thing that he can draw her into.
Yeah.
Like, there's something appealing about that to women. And like I said, like, seeing someone who's powerful and successful and like a beast, right? And I don't mean that in a bad way. And having control over that, being able to tame that and make that fall in love with you is actually kind of a thing women enjoy. Like, that's why it's a trope. Because both sides, when they fall into that roles, it's something that benefits them, it's something that works, and it's something that they enjoy.
We'll get canceled for this one.
Look, this isn't how it has to be exactly for everyone. No. This is extrapolated from...
They're archetypes for a reason.
The stereotypes, the archetypes which exist for a reason.
They're hero myths for a reason.
And it's at least worthwhile understanding that side of it. Even if you don't fall perfectly into those. And by the way, we don't fall perfectly into those archetypes either.
No.
There are certain aspects of them which are applicable for us. But, like, I'm by no means, like a typical, like, quote-unquote housewife woman, right? I'm not. I work full-time.
You are literally an engineer.
Yeah, I know. I'm very much not that. So, regardless of if you fall into those types of archetypes, 2%, 0%, or 80%, or 90%, it's worthwhile understanding those and why they exist. and maybe how
Yeah.
they might influence your relationship,
Or
if they do at
even
all.
or even just understanding, like, okay, why is it that women are attracted to, like, I think at least this answers the question in part, why are women attracted to the bad boys? Why are men attracted to the good Christian girls? Why are, right, and why do those two people get together? And it's like, well, this right here.
Yeah.
Now, to your point, not every single person falls into every single category, but I think it lends a lot of insight into some of these things. And I do think that some degree of this is highly beneficial in relationships. And I think the way that you keep it in balance is by doing those things together, by doing those hard things to gain respect.
Right, because it does need to be a mutual respect.
Yeah.
Right?
There's a
Relationships can fall out of balance, tilting one way or another, right? You can get a man who's way overbearing, doesn't respect his wife at all, doesn't listen to her, and just expects complete submission and nothing else.
It's not a good thing.
And that can be really bad. It can fall the other way, and you can have a woman who's way, overbearing and commanding and, manipulative, whatever.
Yeah.
Like, both of those are bad.
Yeah.
Right? And you can fall wherever you want on the spectrum, but you need to be aligned with your partner on it and figure out what works for the dynamic of your relationship. This that we've talked about, this is just kind of what works for us, and it's how we've been influenced by both of our parents that we've seen, and also just working through things in our relationship together.
And I think kind of how that mirrors some of the archetypes that you see in stories and
Yeah, it does.
things like that. Yeah. Well, with that, it's getting late. Recently, we were at church service, and my wife was teasing me a little bit because I put in my earplugs like I always do, because it's pretty loud in there, and I want to prevent against kind of like hearing degradation, right? And it got me thinking about, what does and doesn't hurt your ears, because, I've got a pair of headphones that are reference headphones, and I can listen to them a lot louder and still be comfortable than other things. And I think perhaps somebody can write in and tell us if there's some studies on this, but I think the higher quality the reproduction of a sound is, the more natural it is, the more volume you're able to take, right? It's less pitchy, it's less volatile in some of the tones. I wonder if part of the reason that older generations were having the hearing issues that they had were because of loud environments, but also like poorly reproduced sound that they kept turning up. That's just something I've been musing about, though. If you've got any thoughts on this or any other topics that you'd like to hear us address, please feel free to send us an email at secondpartypodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Well, with that, thank you again for listening, and have a good night.